Professor Keith is a professor in the Department of Geophysical Sciences at the University of Chicago. He previously served as a Gordon Mackay Professor of Applied Physics at Harvard University's Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences and Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. He led the development of Harvard's Solar Geoengineering Research Program. He's also the founding faculty director of the Climate Systems Engineering Initiative at the University of Chicago and founder of Carbon Engineering, a Canadian company developing technology to capture carbon dioxide from ambient air. He is a winner of MIT's Prize for Excellence in Experimental Physics and one of Time Magazine's Heroes of the Environment. A very warm welcome to you, David, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Really a pleasure and honor to be here. I'm not sure which mic I should be using.
No, literally.
A pleasure and an honor. Is it here or here? Should I pay attention to this?
Yeah, you don't
Okay. Yeah, really a pleasure and honor. So I'm not going to speak for very long. I'm going to give you some overview of how I think about the climate problem. And then I'd really like to get a bunch of questions because I think I can be most useful to you if I hear the questions from you, because I don't know you, don't know where you're coming from, and I'm probably better responding to questions. So thank you very, very much for that introduction. I think maybe one thing I bring is this relatively long perspective working on climate now for a third of a century. And so I've seen lots of change, and I've worked on those things that you heard about. Maybe to say a little bit more, I did work on some real kind of classic climate science, climate modeling, and trying to fly some instruments in space to measure the temperature of the Earth. And I did a lot of early work on CO2 capture and storage and electric power. But I think what I really want to do is give some kind of big picture of how the climate problem is changing. So maybe to me, the biggest thing I would say is this feels like the end of the beginning of the kind of climate battle. So the world is now spending just a little over $1 trillion a year of flow of money into clean energy. So that's mostly wind, solar, and electric vehicles. So it's a little over 1% of GDP globally, which is stunning. So that's up a factor of sort of 3 compared to what it was just a few years ago. I used to give lots of talks where I'd say that it was a phony war. I'd say that politicians talked about climate change and everybody would say how much they cared about it, but there wasn't really anything happening. But you can't say that anymore. The world really is, different countries in different ways, making changes. Obviously, lots of money's being wasted. It could be done better in all sorts of ways. That's the job of policy and planning people like us to help figure out. But I think it really is different than it was even 5 years ago in the sense that there's this sense of real action happening in a way that just wasn't true before. I think the other thing that I think about the most, that's kind of obvious, but I think it's important how much has changed, is the extraordinary way in which solar got cheap. I think it's easy to get lost in all the different technologies, but I think it really is the dominant thing, or will become the dominant thing. I say this, I always think you learn a lot in your career when you're wrong. So I wrote some papers about how the solar learning curve was flattening out. I thought people were overselling solar. That's a lot of the reason that I worked on, say, coal with capture, was because we thought solar would just be too slow to get cheap. I never would have guessed that now, even here in 2023 in India, there's multiple solar farms that are over 2 gigawatts. It's stunning. And that the costs of building these things, capital costs, are now getting well under $500 a kW. It's really amazing. And obviously, that doesn't mean the world's energy problems are over. The sun only shines during the day. This is only good in places where land is relatively cheap and where it's very sunny. So there's all sorts of real problems in implementing large-scale solar. But I think it feels just different than it did. And there seems to be no obvious reason why we can't keep grinding down the cost of these solar technologies. I don't want to say solar only. I think wind is important, but wind is important in different ways. There are fundamental geophysical limits to the scale which you can make wind without big environmental impacts. So I think wind has limits in a way that solar doesn't. To think about the world as a whole, we can get to India and other individual places. The world as a whole is now coming up to 20 terawatts or so of primary power. And if you hope that the poor world, including lots of poor people in India, get richer, get more access to energy, get more access to the thing energy brings, clean water, computation, transportation, communications, you might hope that the world will use a lot more energy in, say, the latter part of this century. And it's easy to imagine powering the world with 30 terawatts or 40 terawatts of solar. Obviously, you've got problems of transmission and batteries or storage, how you're going to manage it, we can talk about it. Whereas you really can't imagine that from hydro is limited to 2 terawatts or something. Wind has some fundamental limits. Other biofuels have huge environmental limits. So for me, if you really think about how you're going to decarbonize the world, the long-term pathways are solar and nuclear power. And nuclear power looks in some sense less interesting than it did because solar just looks a lot cheaper and you can build these things in lumps. So that really is different. I also think that it's the end of the beginning in that there's maybe the end to some kind of overhype and silliness around climate. So I worked on climate my whole career, but I completely understand that climate is just one of many environmental and social problems we face. And I think there's a way that there's a kind of overstatement of how serious climate is. Climate is serious. We will have to decarbonize. We will have to get to net zero. But it's important to think, as I'm sure lots of you are thinking, about the trade-offs that we face. I mean, again, thinking globally, but India is actually, many of these numbers not far off the global average. Globally, more than 5 million people a year dying from air pollution, whereas from heat-related mortality from climate is under a tenth that. So as of today, I think while climate is something we must work on, there are pathways to decarbonize. We have to balance that with development, and obviously, in countries that are still poorer countries that need to develop like India, you have to be serious about allowing development to happen in a way that maybe is more than is being said in a lot of the climate kind of academic work. You have to assume there's going to be real development of the energy and economic sector in India, and decarbonization is going to happen, but it's not going to happen as soon as people think. I think to say a thing that, again, probably many people know, but it's easy to forget. We get so wrapped up in the politics of the 1.5 target. It's important to remember that it is just a political target. There's no scientific significance to 1.5 versus 1.6 or 1.8. What we know scientifically is the hotter it gets, the worse it gets. We know that it gets non-linearly worse, so every added increment is worse than the one before it. And we know that the uncertainty grows with temperature. But it is just not true that science can deliver us a correct answer. And it's fundamentally a political choice. And I think maybe if we'd started in 1960, it would have been possible to get to 1.5 in a realistic way. But I think it's important to say there's no plausible way the world gets to 1.5 without a massive war or something. It's just not plausible to happen. And yet I think a lot of the climate analytical community is still bound up in that in a way that makes it confusing and implausible. One more thing on climate impacts. I think lots of the talk in the popular press, but also in professionals, about climate impacts is about droughts and storms and wildfires where I live. And those are important things, and impacts on crops are important. But I think there's growing evidence, and actually my colleague at U Chicago, Michael Greenstone, has been one of the leaders of this. There's growing evidence that the old-fashioned impact of heat on productivity, human productivity, economic productivity, on human morbidity and mortality, and even on human ability to learn, the impacts of heat are probably going to be the dominant impact of climate change. And they're big and they're regressive. So, to give you a sense of the numbers, a year that is a degree C warmer than average reduces India's growth rate by about 30%. It increases Sweden's growth rate by 40%. That's the Birkedal number. Yeah.
Can you repeat
So
that?
if you look at the economic data on economic growth, and you look at the economic data on temperature, and you do a clever correlation analysis, the numbers I'm giving you are derived from the Birkedal analysis, but there's lots of analysis now that get about the same answer. What you find is that added increment of temperature in hot countries tends to make people worse off. It decreases economic growth. And an added increment of temperature in very cold countries tends to increase economic growth. So if you look in Sweden, a relatively cold country, or Canada, but I know the number, I've got it written down for Sweden. If it's 1 C warmer than average, the economy on average would grow 40% faster than it otherwise would, the incremental growth. And in India, almost the opposite. So that means one of the profound net effects of warming is to make it harder for countries in the developing hot world to develop. It's a fundamental challenge.
Number, you said 1 degree increase.
30%
decline
in the growth rate. Not in the economy overall, but in the growth of the economy. Yeah. It's a big number. Do I totally believe those numbers? I don't know. You're better to ask my friend Michael Greenstone. But at this point, there's been a lot of different analyses that get to this. And it's not just economic. There's analysis that deals with people's ability to learn. So a wonderful student or friend of mine who was a Rhodes Scholar did some great work on New York City schools, but it's now been done other places too. And a year that's a standard deviation hotter than normal, students learn significantly less based on standardized tests. And you see that in many measures. It actually reduces their ability to learn. And I think what that tells you is that air conditioning is not just a luxury, but actually is a productivity measure. Probably not as easier for me to convince this audience than an audience in Canada that this is true, but I think people still forget it. The data is really stunning. There's an amazing paper that was done in the US with this modern econometric analysis of 20 million people. I'm in the age cohort of this study that shows that if being an extra day over 30 C when you're in utero, when you're the last trimester of your mother's pregnancy, reduces your income 30 years later by 0.1%. It's a real measurable thing. Presumably that's got to be brain damage. We don't know it. So I think the lesson from all that is that I'm not trying to say climate is unimportant.
Can I just
Yep.
interrupt for a second? Because Dr. Paul
Yep.
is our leading thinker on health.
And a pediatrician.
Yeah.
I think it would be very good if you alert him to which papers.
I'm happy to send those papers. I am, to be clear, this isn't my work, but I think what I'm trying to do is point to that beyond all the talk about, of course, extreme storms get the news, and extreme storms are terrible for people who are caught in them, that the bigger, longer impact of climate may be on human productivity with heat. And really more than agriculture, because agriculture can adapt more than people can directly. Okay, so I think my message there is that a message of kind of climate moderation, that we have to deal with the reality of climate change, that we are going to decarbonize, but we're not going to decarbonize half the world in a decade, and especially for India, thinking realistically about what is the pathway to decarbonization and about what else we do. So now I want to step back and talk a little bit about my work. I think the big message I would have is that, of course, decarbonization is crucial. It's the central thing we must do about climate. But I think for climate, we have to start thinking in 4 dimensions. That doesn't mean we do them all, but we have to at least think about 4 dimensions, where one dimension is cutting emissions, decarbonization. The other, and maybe equally or certainly the other very important one, is local adaptation, all the methods that reduce the impacts of heat and other things. But then we have to think seriously about removing carbon, which I'll talk more about. This is the stuff I work on. And this most scary and strange one, solar geoengineering, these particular artificial ideas that I and others have worked on. So let me talk a little bit about those, because you probably have heard less about them. So first, about carbon removal. It's easy to forget, but the most kind of fundamental fact about climate science for public policy is that warming is proportional to cumulative emissions. So that means that, of course, when emissions stop, the problem stays the same. When emissions stop, we just stop the problem getting worse. We don't make the problem better. So if you actually want to reduce these long-run impacts of climate, getting to net zero doesn't reduce the impacts. Getting to net zero reduces the growth of the impacts. If you want to reduce the long-run climate change this century, you need to actually take the carbon out of the air, as well as bringing emissions to net zero. So this is a thing that in a way we've known forever. Like the first papers about this actually go back to the 60s. It's not a new idea, but it was sort of hidden from the climate dialogue. And now there's suddenly a lot of excitement about carbon removal. Happy to answer a lot more in questions. But I'll say, obviously I worked on this company that has done well developing direct air capture, which is one method. But there are a lot of new ideas, and some of them are potentially quite applicable for the Indian situation. One of them that's getting a lot of attention that I think is worth thinking about is enhanced rock weathering, which is the idea that you grind up rocks that are basement rocks, granitic or ultramafic rocks. These are the rocks whose weathering will remove and neutralize CO2 from the atmosphere. That's the long-term natural thing that will happen anyway if humans disappeared. And that weathering reaction is the natural reaction. But if you grind up those rocks and put them in soils, you accelerate that weathering and you remove carbon from the atmosphere permanently. So I think we actually don't know about what the environmental risks are, about how expensive it really is, about how well it works. There's a bunch of deep questions. Right now, there's a bunch of startup companies moving very fast. There will be more than 1 million tons a year of claim removals this year, and probably double that next year. It's happening quickly. I've heard there are some Indian companies interested. It's obvious that given India's agricultural strength, given the fact that it's not inherently very expensive to do this, you need, as one of the experts told me, you need a ball mill. A ball mill is a mill for grinding up stone into, you need kind of 0.5 millimeter size stone, and then you just need regular agricultural machinery to spread it on soils. This is something that it's worth thinking about, not rushing into, but we need to know more about it. There are related ideas for biomass wood capture, ideas for putting the same kind of rocks in the ocean to try and remove carbon permanently. So there's a bunch of these ideas for carbon removal. To be clear, in the short term, I absolutely believe that almost all our effort in net emissions should be on cutting emissions. So critics will say we shouldn't think about carbon removal because it will distract us from cutting emissions. In a sense, I think they're right. But in public policy, you have to do more than one thing at once. So we need to put most of our effort to cut emissions, but we need to understand these technologies for carbon removal. I'm happy to answer more of that in questions. And then just to kind of finish this overview, so the fourth of those big things, emissions cuts and carbon removal and solar geoengineering and adaptation is solar geoengineering. This is this idea that humans could deliberately alter the radiative balance of the Earth, the amount of sunlight that's absorbed by adding aerosols, little particles to the upper atmosphere or to clouds to change the Earth's reflectivity a little bit. These ideas are not new. They were the very first report that went to a major political leader on climate, went to President Johnson when I was 2 years old. And the only thing it talked about doing to reduce the risk of climate change was putting reflective chips on the ocean. So it had an early climate model, it had the early CO2 data, they knew the problem, and that's all they suggested. So these are not new ideas. I think these ideas both seem crazy, but also there's increasing evidence they're practical. So I would say if you're going to read one thing, read the UNEP One Atmosphere report that came out recently. And you also have, I should say in India, 2 researchers who are pretty prominent. So most of all, Bala Govindasamy at IISc Bangalore. He along with Ken Caldera published the very first climate modeling paper, modern climate modeling paper on solar geoengineering. I'm going to a meeting he's running the last 2 days of this week. So he's really very well connected, but there's others. Arnab Ghosh at CEW has been involved in conversations about the policy of this for more than a decade when I first met him. And Abhij Sagar, who's founded the IIT Delhi Policy School, he served on the US National Academy Solar Geoengineering report, so he's pretty connected to this. So there are plenty of people in India who know something already. I should say one of my kind of underlying goals here at this, I'm just happy to answer your questions, but one of the reasons I'm traveling here is I think it would be healthy for India to have some real research leadership in this area. That doesn't commit India or anywhere else to do it. To be clear, I am not saying we should do solar geoengineering. What I am saying is we should learn more. And learning more might show that it's too dangerous or it doesn't work. Or learning more might show that it's worth doing. but I think there's a real case for learning more. And I think there's a case for a country like India has a lot of the skills, and it's actually such a small area of research and so cheap, it wouldn't take much resources, to actually have a little more research leadership in that area. Right now, most of the research is in a few rich world countries. Happy to answer any more questions about either these unusual technologies, carbon removal or solar geoengineering, or the kind of larger climate context. Thank you very much for lending me your time.